Yes, one moment, I have to search my presentation. I don't have a presentation, so I just will talk to you. On October the 7th, during the attack on Israel by the Islamist terrorist organization Hamas, several of the heavily armed fighters wore body cams and filmed their crimes. Some of this footage was edited as propaganda material and broadcasted on the Hamas channel Al-Aqsa TV. In addition, many videos were also posted directly on social media so that the first images could already be seen worldwide on that Saturday morning. This means it was already clear on the morning of October 7 that the Hamas attack had a gender-specific dimension and that sexual violence was being used as a weapon of war. Videos such as from Nama Levi, Shani Luke, or from the Nova Festival support this thesis. These types of videos are an instrument of psychological warfare. According to psychologist Rolf Pohl, filming oneself raping and killing is a modern variant of displaying war trophies in order to demonstrate one's own strength twice over. Once, in the first sense in the physical execution, and then again online, because the spread of violent videos and social media intensifies the psychological effect. Even if this public demonstration of power through the staging of murder and rape is incomprehensible, the phenomenon is not entirely new. Social scientist Ferda Berse points out that in 2014, when the so-called IS murdered, abducted, and abused thousands of Yazidis as sex slaves, this was also documented and published on video. In this context, she says that the Islamist groups are engaging in a competitive logic of outdoing each other with increasingly professional documentation of their cruel, despicable acts. They use modern techniques, even if their Manichaean worldview is actually anti-modern and therefore anti-Western. The media portrayal of sexual violence and other atrocities can therefore be seen as a sign of Islamist terrorism. Through the media presentation of their acts, these men communicate not only with the rest of the world, but also with each other over videos. It is also part of this media strategy, typical for the post-factual age, to simply deny the acts afterwards, even though we all have saw them and therefore heard the victims and their families a second time. Sexual violence is a long-established method of psychological warfare and in armed conflict. It is not just about killing, but about causing the greatest possible horror in a population, making the people's worst fears come true, and destroying all feelings of security. The women's bodies becomes a symbol of the nation that is intended to be violated. Hamas is obviously aiming to kill and humiliate women because they stand for the continued existence of the people in Israel. The fact that a woman's body can symbolize a nation is only possible because of patriarchy. The woman becomes the plaything of male alliance, and her body becomes the battlefield of the libidinal campaign of anti-Semitic and misogynist hatred. From this, it can be concluded that the rapes by Hamas are based on a threefold hatred. The victims are Israeli, which symbolizes the hatred of the state of Israel. They are Jewish, which illustrates the anti-Semitic content, and most of them were women, which shows the misogynist aspect of the violence. Of course, also men and queer people were victims of the sexual violence, although this has hardly been recognized. International law recognizes sexual violence as a weapon of war when it's used deliberately, strategically, and systematically, as happened on October 7. It is then also described as genocidal and a crime against humanity. I would like now to go a step further and address the function of the naming of denial sexual violence as a weapon of war because it has a dual function. On the one hand, it is used by the perpetrators directly against people, and the effect is increased when the offenses can be seen online. On the other hand, the addressing of denial of violence perpetrated can also be instrumentalized as a weapon. For example, it can be used to characterize the perpetrators. Here are two examples for that. Meanwhile, the first example is a well-known argument. The US and Israeli propaganda machine has launched a new argument in defense of Israeli genocide in Gaza. The claim that Hamas has committed mass rape against Israeli women. The sexual violence is denied, and the accusation is made that Israel is inventing it to justify the war against Hamas. It is negated here to make Israel look guilty, and at the same time to absolve Hamas and others of accusation of having committed crimes. This should make it easier to show solidarity with Hamas. Second example. The right-wing Israeli ex-defense minister Yoav Gallant referred to the Palestinians as human animals in response to October 7. Here, the sexual violence that has occurred is instrumentalized in order to degrade the opponent and thus mobilize for war. Because if the opponent is seen as evil, it is easier to justify also killings of civilians. This means that both the Israeli and the Palestinian authorities are using the sexual violence that has been committed in this conflict to portray the other side as morally inferior and mobilized for war. Thus, from a feminist perspective, we need to take a closer look. Who is addressing sexual violence, when, how, and why? It is often not about those who are affected or about combating sexual violence in general. The condemnation of sexual violence is instrumentalized and used as a moral weapon in this conflict. It is not sexual violence as such that is condemned, but the sexual violence of the others. From a feminist point of view, sexual violence should therefore always be condemned, regardless who the victims and the perpetrators are, and even so more the unbelievable sexual violence in hundreds of feminicides committed by Hamas on October 7. But, as we all know, a feminist wave of solidarity with Israeli victims failed to materialize. Shortly after 10/7, we can conclude that it has been demonized, for example, by UN Women. The initial silence, the failure to speak up, the late admissions of sexual violence has caused harm. For many survivors and their relatives, not being listened to properly is a second trauma. And it didn't take long for the silence to turn into relativization and then into open denial, so-called rape denial. On social media and at multiple pro-Palestine demonstrations, feminist groups have spoken out in a false sense for solidarity with Palestine, have reversed the victim-perpetrator relationship. They reinterpreted the anti-Semitic misogynist violence of Hamas as a legitimate act of resistance against an alleged Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip. World-famous feminists such as Judith Butler relativized the Hamas massacre or even celebrated as an act of legitimate resistance. They not only cast doubt on numerous reports of sexual violence, but also demand proof from the victims, or this demand blatantly deviates from the queer feminist partiality practiced with those affected. In view of anti-Semitic derailments at the pro-Palestine demonstration, the university occupation or queer feminist icon Judith Butler, two questions make sense. Firstly, why do so many feminists show solidarity with Islamists, specifically Hamas, even though they were their natural enemies, so to speak? Secondly, why is global anti-Semitism on the increase in so-called progressive cycles? I would like to discuss this shortly from three different angles: the individual, the theoretical, and the political perspective. These are not separate, but closely interlinked and affect one another. On the individual level, the answer at first is quite simple. Some feminists are simply anti-Semitic. Being affected by one form of discrimination does not mean being free of discrimination yourself. And just as there are sexist women, there are anti-Semitic Jews or racist PPOCs. Regarding the pro-Palestine demonstration, you can see anti-Semitism in its function as a defense against guilt and exoneration. Auf Deutsch Entlastungs- und Schuldwehr-Antisemitismus. It seems that it's finally allowed to hate the Jews again, under the guise of anti-Zionism. The distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is used to justify one's own hatred. In Germany in particular, a massive perpetrator-victim reversal is taking place. I would even go so far to say that the Israel-related anti-Semitism is a late emotional reparation for the grandchildren of the perpetrators. If the Jews are finally not longer victims, but perpetrators, and the worst ones, just think of the countless Holocaust and Gaza comparisons, then you and yourself are finally on the right side of history. The popular slogan, Free Palestine from German Guilt, is thus to be understood as the crystallization of a massive projective interpretation. Next, I would like to address the theoretical level. Feminist theory is closely linked to post-colonial theory, especially via the queer feminism paradigm of intersectionality. First, I would like to briefly discuss some specifics of post-colonial theory and then draw the line to intersectionality. Postcolonial and critical race theory refers to post-structuralist and postcolonial approaches, such as those from Michel Foucault, Edward Said, or Beatrice Spivak. From this theoretical perspective, global colonial and postcolonial dominance relations are center of criticism. The Enlightenment ideals of reason and autonomy are viewed in the context of these structures and marked as Western and therefore problematic. It is assumed that concepts such as reason and autonomy are used to justify certain world orders and social orders that repeatedly produce systematic conditions of privilege and marginalization. From a post-colonial racism critical perspective, solidarity applies to the weak, marginalized, and excluded who defend themselves against their oppressions. And the Palestinians are the oppressed par excellence. Critical race theory is not direct against a specific worldview as the criticism of antisemitism does, but against a relationship of power and dominance in which one group has privileged access to material and symbolic resources and the other does not. Regarding the Middle East conflict, Israel is considered a colonial project, and the ongoing hostile reaction to Israel is then not attributed to antisemitism, but rather categorized in the history of anti-colonial resistance and solidarity movements. What this approach fails to recognize is that there are also hierarchies and violence among the oppressed. For example, the Gaza Strip is very dangerous for queer individuals or feminists, and certainly not only because of the Israeli army, but because of patriarchal religious and social structures there. Overall, postcolonial theory has a dualistic view, and anti-Semitism is often misunderstood as a subform of racism. As a result, the specificity and complexity of modern antisemitism, and above all, the positioning of Jews in European societies, cannot be grasped. What can then happen is that Jews suddenly become white colonizers. I will leave out the connection to different approaches to current intersectional theories because of the time, but maybe we can come back into the discussion to it. So I'm moving forward to the analysis of the political movements. I also will do this very briefly. There is an international trend of feminist Palestine solidarity that has been going on for about 2 decades, so a very long time. This can be seen in the fact that intersectional and queer feminist movements often declare their support for the boycott, divestment, sanctions, and similar campaigns, which is directed against Israel's alleged apartheid policy and genocide. Another reason for the rise of anti-Semitism in the feminist left-wing circles are shifts in the left-wing movement as such. In recent years, the influence of authoritarian organized communist groups has grown steadily. In Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, for example, they are currently appearing at pro-Palestine demonstrations and university occupations, where they often act as organizers alongside various queer and student groups. The unconsolidated political attitude of young students makes it easy for the leaders to offer short answers as simple and quick solutions to complex problems. One example of this is the unfinished criticism of capitalism, which is often structurally anti-Semitic. Under the guise of Palestine solidarity, anti-Semitism is presented as a legitimate standpoint that is supposedly derived from a feminist and left-wing perspective. And it's sad to say, but I think this is the most popular feminist left-wing perspective from nowadays. So thank you for the attention, and yeah, I'm looking forward for the next talk.